Hey there, students. This is Mr. Corrigal. This slideshow asks the question, what will we be reading in class this year? English class is actually pretty simple. The questions never really change. What changes is the texts and the difficulty and complexity of the texts. So therefore, what will we read in this class? Well, the first thing is narratives and fiction. Um, So, how should we be reading narratives? And I'm going to break it up into a process for you. Step one in reading narratives, you should understand plot. The question that goes along with this is you should know what is going on, or the question is what is going on in the stories that we read. In order to get good grades and sound intelligent in answering that question, what is going on? These are some of the terms that you will need to know and understand, and um, you should be able to define them and use them in your writing and speaking. This all begs the question, how will your understanding of plot be graded? And the answer to that question is you will be required to complete plot graphs, and you will also have to do news reports which detail the factual information of a story, that is the 5 W's and H. This is important. Summarizing plot is a middle school skill, and in order to pass and be successful in high school, you need to be able to do more than just summarize a text. You have to move on to something called analysis, which moves us on to step two. Um, you have to understand character, and you have to be able to analyze character in order to be successful in high school. The question that goes along with this literary element of character is, who are these people? You have to be able to answer that question. These are some of the terms that we will discuss and we will teach you over your time in high school here at Castlebrook. So you'll have to understand these definitions. You'll also have to know how to use these words and these terms both in speaking and in writing. I want you to understand that these terms are sort of on a spectrum. Uh, at the top of this box is perhaps easier ideas, easier concepts, and as we move down the list, the concepts become more complex and more difficult. This begs the question, how will your understanding of character be graded? Well, you'll be required to take notes and write paragraphs on characters that you read about. Why do we do this? We read narratives and we analyze characters in the fiction that we read because fictional characters represent real people, the ones we live with and work with. Therefore, analyzing fictional characters develops empathy, emotional intelligence, cultural competence, and interpersonal skills. Step three in reading a narrative, you should understand conflict. You should be able to analyze conflict. And the question that goes along with this literary element of conflict is, what's the problem? In order to answer that question effectively, you need to know several of these vocabulary terms. You need to know the different types of conflict. You need to know how to differentiate between minor conflicts and major conflicts. You should understand internal versus external conflicts. And we will also teach you and talk about the following terms: dystopias, different types of power, the tragic hero. Um, and we'll get into that. Once again, these terms are on a bit of a spectrum, and they go from easy to difficult. And just like before, you'll be required to take notes and write paragraphs on the topic of conflict. Why do we do this? We read narratives and fiction because fictional conflicts represent real problems we will have in our lives. Therefore, analyzing fictional conflicts develops our abilities to problem solve and resolve the conflicts in our own life. Step number 4 in reading a narrative, you should understand something called form And the question that goes along with this literary element of form is the question, how is it written? In order to understand, in order to answer that question effectively, you will need to understand a lot of the vocabulary terms in this box. And once again, we'll be reviewing and talking about those in class. And once again, they are on a bit of a spectrum ranging from easy to difficult terms. Once again, your understanding of form will be graded based on the notes you take and the paragraphs you write. We'll also have class discussion, which will be worth something. Why do we do this? We read narratives and fiction because studying the forms that great writers use, it equips us to use language powerfully as well. One day you may have to write a speech or captivate an audience, motivate a team, or persuade others to believe in your opinion. Using language powerfully is difficult. We do need models, and I suggest that you start practicing that now. Many of you have already been practicing that for several years. Step number 5 in how you should read a narrative. You need to understand something called theme. One of the questions we ask after we read something, a story or a narrative, is, why did the author write it? In order to write good thesis statements, in order to concisely communicate about theme, you'll have to understand several of these vocabulary terms. And once again, we'll discuss and teach those to you over the course of this semester. Once again, theme and thesis statements are tightly connected. You have to be able to argue your opinion about what the central idea of a work is. It sounds like an easy thing in this context, but it's a difficult thing to do because these stories can be complex and there can be several conflicting ideas. Why do we do this? Well, we read narratives and fiction because identifying themes allows us to learn life lessons as second-hand observers. Experience is a great teacher, but young people and even older people like myself, we don't have a lot of life experience on our own. The good news is we can gain life experience by reading and listening to the stories of those wiser than ourselves. Well, that finishes up the steps or the process that I'll be guiding you through in terms of narrative and fictional texts. And those are some of the things that we'll be reading in this class. Secondly, we will be reading nonfiction and informational texts in our class. Well, how are we supposed to read those? Once again, I'm going to give you a bit of a process or a sequence to follow. The number one, so how should I read nonfiction texts? Well, the first thing that you should do is make connections. Ask yourself, how do nonfiction texts connect to the narratives we read? There's several different kinds of connections, and you should have heard about these already in your school career. Firstly, a text-to-self connection. Reading reminds you of things in your life. Secondly, and this is what teachers do usually with nonfiction texts, they want you to be able to connect a narrative text to another text that we have read in class. As I say here, English teachers usually choose nonfiction texts to supplement a narrative. We don't just choose them randomly. And further, there is such a thing as a text-to-world connection. Once again, teachers also teach historical and/or current events to supplement a narrative. The idea in nonfiction texts almost always connects to ideas found in the stories we read. Your job is to find those connections. Therefore, in your notes packages and in your reading and speaking, we will be looking for your ability to make connections. Once again, reading a variety of texts, fictional and non-fiction, will make you more literate, Powerfully literate people can make sense of a lot of different kinds of texts, whether that be digital, graphic texts, articles, informational texts, documentaries, as well as the plain old narrative story, which is sort of a staple in English class. Step 2, something else that you should do when you read a nonfiction text. You should notice text structures. In order to do this, you need to understand these following terms. Text structures include description or definition, sequence, comparison, cause and effect, problem and solution, argument. Each of these text structures has its own signal or transition words. You should also understand superordinate structures, which means structures that govern an entire nonfiction work, like the overarching point of an article or a piece of literary criticism. Also, there is such a thing called a subordinate structure, which means within a piece of nonfiction, sometimes there will be subtopics, and each of those may have their own text structure. If you want to find out more about that, you can click on the link. Once again, all of the underlined terms in these boxes, these signify that there's a hyperlink which will take you to a place where you can learn more. How will you be graded? You will be required to identify text structures after reading nonfiction texts, both verbally and in writing. You also want to be able to reference important definitions, sequences, comparisons, problems, solutions, and arguments in your reading notes and also in your essays. Learning text structures will help you understand nonfiction text better, and it will also make presenting your own ideas easier, and it will give you more clarity in your own communication. Alright, so those are the two major steps in reading nonfiction informational texts, which leads us to the last type of reading that we will be doing in our classes, which means we'll be reading poetry. There's a simple handout for this. I'll be giving this to you over the course of the semester, but this is a sequence. This handout is called How to Read a Poem by Jim Burke, and when we read poetry, I'll be expecting you guys follow this sequence. Okay, and that sums up basically all the reading components which the English curriculum in Ontario require us to do. This is how we'll be reading like a dragon this semester. Hope you enjoyed the instructional video.